It all started with a memory card that was found on a street in Anchorage. This card contained 39 disturbing images and 12 horrifying videos. And what these depicted was a woman's final moments. Her final moments of fear and terror. She was being strangled, she was being beaten, she was being mocked, all whilst her killer filmed every single second. This memory card was simply labelled Homicide at Midtown Marriott. This man behind the camera, he wasn't some shadowy figure. He was Anchorage's trusted handyman. A South African man who spoke softly and politely, who blended perfectly into Alaskan life, who worked at a hotel. And his name was Brian Stephen Smith. And when the police uncovered the evidence on this SD card, they didn't just find evidence of a murder, they found a window into the mind of a predator who might have been hunting for years and who has terrifyingly lived in plain sight. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. If you are new here, I hope you're all doing so well. If you're new here, my name is Anna. I am a certified yapper. I jump on here twice a week, every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday, and we talk about a true crime case that is really bothering us, really making us lose sleep. Now, if true crime is your jam, I highly suggest you subscribe, get the notification bell on because, well, I'm here for you twice a week, every single week, and it's free. Before we dive into the video, it would absolutely mean the world to me if you can engage with this video in some way. Leave a like, leave a comment, share, that would be amazing. But even better than that, if you could hype the video, I would love you forever. I need your hype points. YouTube tells me it's very important for my channel, so any hype points you can donate, I'm looking for them. But I think I've said everything I need to say. Usual spiel, any details regarding me, myself and I, they're listed down below. Social media handles, products used my face today, all the nitty gritty details that you need. There will be some resource links in the description, which I do talk about at the end, so be sure to check those out as well. But I think that's it. So without any further rambling and any further ado, let's get into the horrifying, devastating case of the scumbag that is Brian Stephen Smith. I am trying my best not to cry, but I have just done exactly what I did with one of my other videos where I filmed so much and realised I never once had my microphone plugged in, so there is no sound. As you can see, I started the makeup, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to the start and I will just get this bit of the story done before I continue with the makeup so everything goes at the same time. I know you don't care about the makeup. Honestly, I cannot believe I did this again. At least with this one, I caught it, 40 minutes in. But that's still 40 minutes that I just don't have to spare these days. Life's busy. Anyway, so what I want you to do, picture that you are walking down a busy street. You are in Anchorage, Alaska. You're walking down, going about your day, just doing your usual. Maybe you're in your happy place in your mind. And then as you're walking by, the sunlight hits something reflective. What could that be? It really catches your eye, so you turn around. You're like a magpie to a shiny object, which, by the way, I know is a myth, but I'm just, you know me, I love an analogy. So it catches your attention and you're a bit curious, curious George. You go over to this object and you see that it's a memory card. You start to think, oh, this could be someone's work, this could be something important, this could be cherished memories on this card, vacation photos, baby photos, wedding photos, it could be anything. So you decide you're going to be a good citizen. You're going to take it home, you're going to find out whose card it is, and you're going to return it. And this is exactly what this woman does this day, and it changes everything. It changes Anchorage, Alaska forever. Because this woman, she takes it home, she pops it into the device, and boom, she is met with complete nightmare fuel. Because instead of vacation photos or baby photos or a wedding or a new house, she finds one singular folder. And this folder says homicide. All in capital letters, like this person who made this folder, they have never heard of subtlety. And this woman, she does what a lot of us would do. Call it morbid curiosity or call it naivety or call it a combination of both. She clicks on the folder and she would open one singular file, and that was enough for her. At first, when she clicked this file, she was thinking, maybe, potentially, this is just some sick joke. Someone's named the folder this as a joke. And this was sick, but it definitely wasn't a joke. The minute she views that first file, she realises that she has stumbled across something that she was never meant to see, that she never should have had to see. And this woman, she doesn't hesitate, she doesn't dilly-dally, she calls the police immediately, quicker than I can click add to cart in a Sephora sale. So once this is handed over to police, detectives, they obviously have to go through this card, they have to find what she was talking about and see what else is there. So they go on, they open this file, and there is 39 images and 12 videos. They're all time-stamped, all very organised, every photo and video is obviously going to be time-stamped, date and time, we know that. But when they're viewing it, there appears to be this very normal-looking hotel room. Beige walls, very ugly carpet. The kind of decor that says, I got this in a corporate discount, but that ugly carpet, that was the least of their thoughts. It was the least of their worries. Because when they view a video within these files, they would find a distressed woman. In the background, there's a man's voice, a South African accent, which to the town of Anchorage, that's a foreign accent. Not many people have it, it's very distinct. And the eerie thing about this man with this accent is he's very calm. There is no chaos, it is all control. Now, this poor woman in the video, she's naked. She is being brutally beaten, she is being brutally tortured, she is being dragged across the room by her hair. She was seen to have been strangled with his hands. He then strangled her again later with a wire, also whilst he sang AC/DC's Thunderstruck, a song that many of us these days would associate with the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders, or just a very, very good band that we will never ever be able to look at the same ever again. Not only this, but this woman was being sexually assaulted. He was kicking her in the stomach, he was kicking her in the genitals with such a brutal force. And it was clear that this woman was in absolute agony. This man then proceeded to stomp on her throat, to basically jump on her throat, also whilst demanding that she died. Now, the only thing at this point that they can identify about this man who is directing his own movie is the South African accent. That's really all they have to go on. So they're listening to it. They're listening to these clips. And they hear him say, in my movies, everybody always dies. In my movies, everybody always dies. Immediately telling police and investigators that this was not this man's first rodeo. This was not his first murder. In another clip, he can be heard saying, what are my followers going to think of me? People need to know when they are being serial killed. So yet again, giving investigators that confirmation that he is absolutely a serial killer. This isn't his first time. And at this point, the accent is all they really have to go on. So they're digging through the files. They're having to view all of these horrific images, all of these horrific sounds. It's brutal. But then they strike gold because they come across a still image. And in this still image, they can see this man clear as daylight. Now, here's the thing about digital files, right? They're kind of tattletales. Whether they mean to be or whether they don't, they are tattletales. That metadata is crucial. We have dates, we have exact timestamps, we even get GPS locations. So the tech team, they look at the GPS locations, they pull the coordinates and they plot them on a map. And guess what? They line up perfectly with a Town Place Suites by Marriott in Midtown Anchorage. So they're like, okay, we've got this, it matches up, that's great, but let's just, cover all bases. So they go on the Marriott website, they're checking, they're looking at the rooms, and when they view it, they see that same fugly carpet that was in the videos. Call it detective work or call it interior design doing the Lord's work. And of course, the police at this time, they still have no idea who's in this video. They have no idea who this poor woman is, no idea who this man is. But luckily, they have his still image. Now, the police, they do play his voice over and over again on a frickin' loop like it was the newest hit on Spotify. Anything that might make him more identifiable. But they decide, you know what, let's just cut the BS, let's just go straight to the source. They head over to the Marriott Hotel. they take his still image and they go up to some of the workers in that hotel and they say, "Do you know this man?" Immediately, there is a quiet awkwardness. Quite clearly, these people know who this man is, but they can't understand why the police would want to know. I mean, this is just a really normal guy who honestly is quite boring. And then a housekeeper speaks up and she says, "That person in that image, that's Brian from maintenance." And just like that, the creepy cretin voice in that video has a name, and that name is Brian Stephen Smith. Thankfully, the police, they're able to confirm via CCTV footage and the metadata from the images that Brian was staying at this Marriott the exact same time these images were made. And what's really chilling is they review the hotel surveillance and they see him walk through. He's carrying his luggage. He's smiling away at staff like this normal, friendly guy. It's just your average Tuesday. Or at least, to them it looked like an average Tuesday. But then again, maybe for Brian, maybe this was his average Tuesday. So detectives, they are checking out everything they possibly can, looking at all the sources. Another team, they pull travel records. They want to see, does Brian live here? Or does he live in South Africa and he's travelled here, maybe he's flying back home? And when they check the records, they do see that Brian is not in Anchorage at the moment. However, it's a return flight and he is due to return in a few days. Whether he will or whether he won't is a question on their lips at this moment. And can I just say, by the way, if ever you want to look guilty in a situation like this, just take off, fly away somewhere else when you commit a crime. Only if you want to be the biggest walking red flag in the country. So a few days later, Brian, he arrives back at Anchorage Airport. And luckily for him, he has got a police escort waiting on him. He must feel like a celebrity. But the police, they approach him, okay? The minute that they approach him, they don't even say why they're there, why they're wanting to speak to him. Brian simply sighs, shrugs his shoulders almost, and goes, "Okay, what? Sorry, what do you mean, okay?" Like anyone else, they'd be like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what the hell's going on? Why on earth are you trying to arrest me? Like, what have I done? Tell me what I've done before you try and arrest me." But Brian, he was either too arrogant to care or he knew his time was up. So, of course, the news breaks in Anchorage of Alaska, actually all over Alaska. Man arrested after SD card reveals disturbing footage. And of course, Anchorage, they go into full gossip mode because, honey, it's a small town and people are going to talk, especially when one of their own has been revealed as potentially a sadistic, evil murderer, torturer, sexual predator. Because the thing is, everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew Brian. He was the handyman. He was the one that worked in the Marriott. He was the one who got your repairs done on time. Brian was a reliable guy. But still at this point, no one knows who this woman in the video is. No one knows why she was with this man. No one knows why this man decided to film her brutal murder. So who is Brian Stephen Smith? Well, his life, honestly quite boring. He was from Queenstown, South Africa. He was born in the late 1970s. And he came from a well thought of, tidy, conservative family. And there would be nothing in this man's background that screamed future serial killer. Nothing at all. There was no trauma narrative. There was no violent childhood. There was no abusive history. And this is exactly what made him so dangerous, because where the hell did this come from? This might be a case where someone was genuinely born evil. So he did grow up disciplined, but he grew up in no way abusive. South African schools at the time, they were quite harsh, they really valued their education, and it wasn't the kind of place where you would get a congratulations or a trophy or a certificate for participation. It was a lot more than that. But luckily for Brian, he fit the mould that school wanted. He was respectful, he had good manners, he was always tidy, he applied himself. He fit in almost a little too well, because in some ways he just disappeared off into the background. But that's how Brian liked it. Now, he wasn't really remembered for much, to be honest, nothing great anyway. The only thing that people could remember him for was being very meticulous. So he was the kind of person that would have his pencils lined up perfectly, completely straight. His books were open, they were flattened down, his pencil case neatly shut, sitting in the perfect place on his desk. Very, very organised. And if someone next to him, on his right or on his left, if they had a bit of a mess on their desk. Their pencils weren't aligned, their jotters were strewn everywhere. Brian couldn't control the impulse to fix it. He had to repair this as well. Anything that seemed like it wasn't perfect to him had to be repaired. So after high school, Brian then goes on to complete national service, and in South Africa at this point, it was mandatory military training. So he completes this. After this, he goes on to get some jobs. He works in the mechanical field and he works in the hospitality field. He was doing maintenance, housekeeping, odd repairs here and there. And his record was clean, not just criminally, but in the workplace. He was efficient at his job, he never left a mess, his bills were always paid on time, he was nice enough to everyone, I mean, didn't really talk at all, but still. So at some point in the early 2000s, Brian decides that he wants to move from Queenstown, South Africa to Anchorage in Alaska. And I did some digging, right? Because I was like, well, that's quite a move. You're going from a hot spot to quite a cold country. Like, what would the reason be behind that? And apparently, it is really as random as it sounds. There was not really any rhyme or reason. His immigration papers, they do state that he originally came to Alaska on a work visa, and then at one point he became a legal resident. People did say that a man moving from Queenstown to Anchorage didn't really make sense. Why would he leave the sun for snow? People would usually do the opposite. But I have to say, as someone who loves the cold, as someone who is desperate to go to Alaska, I would love to live there for a period of time. I love the cold weather. And I know people who live there will probably say, trust me, if you lived here, it's not as good. But I love it. That's what I love about Scotland. I love that we kind of have winter most of the year. Now, the second he arrives in Alaska, he slips right into the hospitality scene. You know what, let me just blend as I tell this. Got to do something. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Alaska relies heavily on tourism. So there's a lot of visitors, a lot of people that come and go. And within the hotels, there's a lot of guests who are there for maybe a couple of days, couple of weeks, and then they leave. So a lot of traffic come and go. And this is perfect for someone like Brian because it means that people never really stay there long enough for people to realise they're missing. Because if someone doesn't return, you just assume that they've went back home, that their trip has ended, not that they've met a brutal demise. And Brian, he was a bit of a hotel hopper. He worked at the Hiltons and he worked at the Marriotts and then he worked at Town Place Suites. And to be fair, he would work there long enough to seem loyal to the job, to the company, but not long enough that people really got to know him. Because that's not what Brian wanted. Brian wanted to be a ghost. Now, his co-workers, they would describe him as being very polite, almost too polite in a way. Like, he was well-mannered and things like that, but he never really joked around. He never really spoke much to his colleagues. And if they ever asked him to go out for drinks after work with the rest of the group, he was always the one turning it down. He had this really weird formality about him, which a lot of people had mistaken for shyness. But this was actually just Brian maintaining a safe distance, so people never got too close. So people didn't have the chance to figure out who he really was. And I do apologise, I don't have the exact date of when this had taken place, but sometime between 2014 and 2015, Brian would marry an Alaskan woman by the name of Alyssa. And when I heard this, I was thinking, Alyssa, you are in danger, my friend. You need to run for the hills and not look back. But according to the record, according to Alyssa herself, their marriage was happy enough. I mean, it was stable. There was nothing untoward. They would buy a nice, modest house that was nearby the old Seward Highway. It was a lovely neighbourhood, it had the nice manicured lawn, and it was a kind of place where neighbours, they wave at you across the street, they honk at you as they pass by in their cars, but no one really asked too much questions, especially if you don't give them the chance to. Neighbours, they said that the couple seemed very normal, especially Alyssa. Alyssa was chatty, she was friendly, she was outgoing. Brian was a lot more quiet and a lot more reserved. They were always seen out together walking their dog, but if ever Brian was by himself, if you started approaching the fence to, have a conversation and get to know your neighbour, you'd simply get a quick nod of the head. Then he was in the house with the doors bolted and the curtains shut. He did not want to talk to you. And people said that, the couple, they didn't argue much, or at least not in a way that anyone heard. There was never any chaos at their house. There was never any calls to the police. Even after Brian was arrested, Alyssa said, One of the reasons that she was so shocked is because she just couldn't see this coming, and not in the way that we hear it in a lot of these cases. She had said that Brian barely ever raised his voice. In fact, she's never really heard it fully raised, and he's never once lifted his hands to her. She had even said that he absolutely loved and adored their dog, which is something we don't see with these kind of sadistic creatures. At home, he tried to portray himself as the caretaker. He was the one doing the organising, paying the bills, tightening the purse strings. Everything in this home was labelled, everything had a place, everything was organised. God, even if you went into his garage, his tools were lined up like surgical items. The kitchen was constantly spotless, and this was all the work of Brian. Even his digital life mirrored his personal life. There was folders within folders within folders. He would have wedding photos, vacation photos, work photos, and then there was a folder that no one was meant to see. The folder that would reveal who he truly was. Of course, I said that he never really interacted with colleagues. He never really cared to get to know them. He wasn't really sociable with them, but the truth is, Brian wasn't sociable at all. He didn't socialise with any friends. He didn't really make any effort to have any friends. He didn't drink. He didn't really do anything because he was always telling people, sorry, I've got emergency maintenance work, can't do it, I'm going to be out late. And his wife, Alyssa, believes that she is just married to a hard-working man that's willing to work all hours in any weather condition to better their life. But that couldn't have been further from the truth, because those late nights, they weren't for stability, they weren't for more money. They were his window of opportunity. And I know you're probably wondering, like, with everything that I've said so far, Anna, was there like no warning signs? There's got to have been like something. There always is with these bags. But literally, there was no warning signs, at least nothing that you would call the police over. This man was far too careful for that. He knew what to do, what not to do, what raised attention and what didn't. And the thing is, he knew that he didn't have to dominate at home because there was a whole other crowd of women out there that he knew he could dominate. He knew he could take advantage of. Now, people have said that in social situations, when he would actually talk, which, remember, isn't very often, but when he did, he apparently came across as quite charming. But in hindsight, a lot of people say, was he really charming or was it just the South African accent? Because that's quite a charming accent. It's a nice one. It has a nice cadence. I could understand why someone would find that charming. But if you really paid attention to Brian, if you listened closely, you'd realise that even when you think he's talking to you, he's not saying very much. He would always deflect the question back. It's like he held up a mirror, your question bounced off it and came right back to yourself. Smile and deflect was his motto. You'd literally leave that conversation thinking, oh, what a nice guy. What a nice conversation. When really he's just like smiled, given you half an answer and be like, so what about you? And then you get to talk about yourself. People would always describe this man as being so helpful. He was always there, he was always getting things done quickly, always getting repairs done on time. But helpful might be one of the most deceiving words in English language. As we know, there is this cliche about serial killers having these double lives. Did Brian have a double life? Not exactly. He had two lives, but he lived them very much separately. One of those lives was the sort of boring suburban life, or at least that's how he felt it was. He thought it was mundane. He would mow the lawn, he would fix repairs in the house. Then the other person, the other life that he lived was the man who saw people, who saw vulnerable women as disposable props for his use, for his private fantasies. Now, police, of course, they have to conduct a search of Brian's home, and when they do this, it was weirdly clean. And I don't mean like, Saturday, Sunday reset, like spring cleaning vibes. I mean, it was a kind of cleaning that was practiced. No mess, no clutter, no stray mail, no drawer filled with random ass letters. Like the jury duty citation that comes and you completely forget to respond. Oops. Again, everything had its place, and even his digital devices. Very clean, very organised. And when they are looking for damning evidence, evidence that shows what he's done, what else he's been up to, they don't find that in the house. because it turns out that also had a place, and that place was in his truck. Now, psychologists, they would later say that Brian Smith, he fitted the organised offender type to an absolute T. High functioning, detail obsessed, narcissistic, the type who feels like they are superior because they're hiding in plain sight. He didn't have random outbursts, uncontrolled violence, because that to him was inefficient. His violence had to be controlled. It had to be methodical, and when he wasn't committing it, he was rehearsing it over and over again in his head. Brian had been living in Anchorage for 2 decades before this SD card was found. That is 20 years of him blending in, earning trust that he did not deserve. Never ever drawing suspicion to himself, and he had built himself the perfect disguise. Be helpful, be polite, be boring, because no one ever suspects boring. When police had showed up at Alyssa's door, the shock that she felt is indescribable, and she actually thought that the police, they were making a mistake. They've got the wrong house. Like, what the hell are you talking about? And in a way, it was, because what she married was a facade. That man didn't actually exist. He was playing a character, he was playing a role. But who he truly was to his core was that sadistic monster that we see on tape, and that is not who she married. She seen no inkling of who that person was. Police had said that the normalcy of Brian's life was exactly what made this case so chilling. He wasn't a drifter going between the cities and towns and picking victims. He was Anchorage's handyman, the one who fixed absolutely everything. So back to the woman in the video, because at this point, when police have opened that SD card, when they've found that file, they can only refer to this woman as Jane Doe for multiple days. Just another missing face in a town that already carries so many missing women posters. And the police said what really hurt most in this case was the anonymity, not knowing who this woman was. How can a woman's life be reduced to a timestamp? At this point, the police, they have no other option than to release one of the images that they've found on this SD card. Now, of course, they do blur it enough to protect this woman's dignity, because, of course, as we know, she was naked in the photos and the videos, but they have to leave her face. They have to identify her, and this wasn't the happy face that people once knew. Thankfully, this image, it would reach the right set of eyes. A community outreach worker immediately recognised that woman. And the second she recognised her, she called it in. The woman in the photos, the woman in this video, was Kathleen Joe Henry. And Kathleen, she was 30 years old. She was from a town called Eek, which is a small Yupik village on Alaska's western coast. Now, when Kathleen's name had finally surfaced, it honestly broke something within the people in Anchorage. For days, this woman on the SD card had been an unnamed victim, a blurred image on a police bulletin board. And when police were able to confirm who the woman was, the story stopped being so abstract. So let's talk about Kathleen Joe Henry, someone who actually deserves the attention. She was born in 1989 in Eek, and this is a place with a population of around 300. Very, very small. And it is the kind of town within Alaska that you only get to by boat, by plane, or by pure stubbornness. There doesn't really seem to be any roads in or out, it's just open tundra and severe weather. Now, where Eek sits, the ice comes and goes, but I mean, a lot of the time, it's pretty much there. It is this beautiful, quiet place. It almost looks idyllic. Everyone knows everyone. Someone's either a cousin, a classmate, or both. When people talk about Kathleen, they say that they can still hear her laugh. Apparently, it was this loud, bellowing, unfiltered laugh that just got everybody else going. Now, of course, growing up in Yupik, she had learned the rhythms of subsistence living. Fishing, berry picking, drying salmon on a rack out the front of your house. Family had said that Kathleen loved to sing while she worked. It was a thing that really made time pass for her. And if you were down the other edge of the river, you could hear Kathleen's voice. Something that is so greatly missed now. She was described as being the kind of child who was both bright and restless. She had a desire to see more of the world. But for people in rural Alaska, the world, sometimes that just means Anchorage. I mean, that is the state's only real city. It's a place where rural Alaskans want to go. This is a place where everything is supposed to happen, like college and jobs, opportunity. And like many other young women in the village, Kathleen was seeking that. That's what she wanted. And so she decides to move to Anchorage. She is chasing something bigger. She wants a bigger life for herself. And she was hoping that by moving to Anchorage, she would find a version of herself that didn't have to fight the same small town expectations. But the thing about Anchorage, and something Kathleen possibly wasn't prepared for, is that it isn't easy on anyone, especially if you arrive there without a safety net. It is a place full of opportunity, but it's also a place that is very expensive. The rent in Anchorage could honestly eat you alive if you're not prepared. And if you don't already know someone, you quickly learn how lonely that cold air can be. Now, some people will say that Alaska has two seasons. There's winter, and then there's preparing for winter. And Kathleen found herself stuck somewhere in between. She was a very, very hard worker, and she would go between multiple jobs doing whatever she could to raise her funds. She was doing food service and cleanings, all the behind the scenes jobs that stopped restaurants and hotels from crumbling. For a while, she would rent a place with a roommate, but money was always tight, and unfortunately, Kathleen would find herself falling into addiction, and any stability that she had known just completely disappeared. Shelter staff and outreach volunteers, they remembered her clearly. They said that she had the kind of face that you don't forget. She had very expressive eyes, and she was always up to something, even if she was exhausted. They always remember her singing Whitney Houston on the karaoke. People would stop to listen to her. She was also known to be very funny. She would roast people, but in this gentle, endearing way. She was never too offensive, but she roasted you enough that, you definitely got roasted, but it made you laugh. She was never cruel about it. Everything was all in good fun, and she could give it out and she could take it back. Kathleen was described as having good stretches. There was periods of time where she would try her best to get clean, and she would be clean for weeks. There was times where she was able to start working again, when she even spoke about going back to Eek to be with her family. But like any form of addiction, when people struggle, they can be easily pulled back into that, and relapse is very normal when you're recovering from addiction. And if anyone out there is recovering from addiction, and if anyone has had a relapse, that doesn't mean that you're unworthy. That doesn't mean that you don't deserve to get better. That doesn't mean that that is all you're going to be. It is just a bump in the road, a bump in your journey, and every single journey has them. When was the last time that you were in a car ride that just went smooth? Probably never, because there's always going to be that hurdle that you need to get over. But with that relapse, you can rebuild again. Get yourself a good support system, whether that's family, whether it's friends, whether it is these programs that you can reach out to, whether it's a phone number you can call. You deserve help. You deserve to heal. You deserve to get better. And if you just keep pushing, if you keep fighting, you will get there. And despite everything that Kathleen was going through, everything that she was struggling with, her family, they never, ever, ever gave up on her. I mean, her mother, Sarah, she would call her every single week. They would talk about family gossip, they'd talk about the weather. Kathleen would ask who caught the best fish that week. They were so close. Now, when the calls had stopped in early September of 2019, her mother and the family, they never really thought much of it. Kathleen would kind of go through periods where she would talk a lot and then she wouldn't talk as much. Usually when she was having a reset, when she was sort of having to pull herself together and come back stronger, she would have a bit of distance. So that to go on for, maybe a week or two wasn't out of the norm. But what was out of the norm was when weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks continued to go by and Kathleen hadn't been heard from. Now, people in Eek, they would ask each other, have you heard from Kathleen? Like, how's she getting on? And the response was always, not lately. No one had heard of her. This woman who was always in contact with family and friends suddenly had fell off the grid. Now, when Kathleen's name had hit the news, the people in Eek, they actually found out through a Facebook post, which is just awful. Her entire village finding out that she has been brutally murdered via Facebook. But I mean, this isn't uncommon for small villages to have to find things out this way. But it doesn't make it any less harrowing. One of her cousins had sat staring at Kathleen's photo for over an hour, convincing themselves that that couldn't be Kathleen in the photo. There's no way, there's got to be something that shows that this isn't Kathleen. But devastatingly it was. Now, Kathleen's village, they would hold a vigil days later, candles, singing, prayers, and in the centre was a photo of Kathleen, and it was her holding a cup of coffee, just smiling at the camera. And the family chose that photo because they wanted her to be remembered as Kathleen. They didn't want her to be remembered as Kathleen, the murder victim, because she was so much more than that. Now, when advocates from Alaska's Native Women's Resource Centre, when they heard about what had happened to Kathleen, they were obviously devastated, but they said that it was eerily familiar. Indigenous women make up 18% of Alaska's population, but do you know that they account for nearly half of Alaska's murder victims? They make up 18% of the population, and yet they are nearly half of the murder victims. Once detectives, when they knew this victim's name, when they knew it was Kathleen Joe Henry, and they knew that they had Brian Smith in custody, they start digging a bit deeper. Because this whole thing with the SD card, finding Kathleen so easily in a way, it felt too easy. There was something very sinister about this, and each detective kept saying, this can't be this man's first time. You are not that bold, you are not that confident if this is your first murder. And so investigators, they start combing their way through every aspect of Brian Smith's life. They need to check travel records, hotel records, even phone data. And the thing that people forget when it comes to Anchorage, the city itself isn't all that big, okay? However, the terrain around it, the land surrounding it, seems like it goes on forever. It's endless. Highways cutting through tundra, dense woods, frozen lakes. If someone wanted to hide a body, they'd have plenty of options. So when detectives are tracing his movements from earlier on in the year, there was one specific place that kept coming up again and again and again. And that was a stretch of the Old Glen Highway near Eklutna. And this was a remote area north of the town that a lot of people would use for scenic drives or hunting trips. It was the perfect landscape. And when detectives find this spot coming up again and again, immediately alarm bells are ringing in their head, because just months before this SD card was found, hikers came across a decomposing body. In this case, it had gone cold almost immediately. These hikers had found the body in July of 2019, but unfortunately, there wasn't much left of this body to work with, and the state of decomposition made it really difficult to identify who it was. And so this body was just named the Jane Doe of Eklutna. And I feel like we've had a Jane Doe of Eklutna before. Was it the Robert Hansen case? The Alaskan butcher Robert Hansen? I feel like there was a Jane Doe of Eklutna then as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I might be right. But I don't know. So they believed that the Jane Doe of Eklutna could be linked to Brian Smith, but they had no way to prove it right away. I mean, after all, there was no evidence that they could use. The body was so decomposed they couldn't identify the woman. But they do have a lot to work with, because they're able to cross-reference cell tower pings. And Brian Smith's phone signal, it appeared in this area. Not once, not twice, multiple times. And not only that, but it was in the same window of time that the coroner had deemed that this woman would have been murdered. And of course, this alone, it's not really enough proof, but it was enough proof to be able to reopen the case. So during one of Brian Smith's early interviews, the detectives, they decide they're going to play a game with him. They're not going to come out and say right away, did you murder a woman in Eklutna and dump her body there or whatever, because that's too easy. And that's too easy for him just to say no or no comment. So they go into the room and they say to him, is there anything else that you would want to tell us? Anything else that you feel like we should know? Imagining in typical sadistic loser fashion that he's going to want to play the long game. But very shockingly, that is when he would say it. Cool, calm, and collected. There's another one. And this would be the moment that a second victim would step out of the shadows. Brian Smith would tell investigators that he had picked up another victim months earlier, that he had offered her a ride and that she had accepted this, and they ended up spending some time together. He then says that things between them got out of hand. Doesn't specify what got out of hand meant right enough. And his phrasing was as sterile as a personality, let me tell you that much. Like, this man is so bland, so boring, so uninteresting. But he stated that he had left his victim's body out by the highway, out by Eklutna, the same highway where they found Jane Doe. So the police, they end up going back to the Eklutna scene. They check the evidence and they confirm that the location where Eklutna Jane Doe was found perfectly matched the description given by Brian Smith. Detectives would then compare DNA from the remains to DNA from missing persons reports, and by late October of 2019 they had their second victim, and this victim was Veronica Abouchuk. And like Kathleen, Veronica, she was an Indigenous woman, an Inupiaq woman who was originally from Nome. Now, she had been reported missing months earlier by her daughter when she stopped answering phone calls. The family, they had put up flyers around Anchorage, they had checked shelters, contacted hospitals. It was the usual desperate routine that we see in families when their loved one goes missing. But at that point, nothing had come back. And police had called Veronica's daughter to alert her to the fact that they have found her mother's remains. Veronica was both relieved to know what had happened to her mother, but she was also devastated. Veronica was only 52 years old, a woman who had grown up in Nome, this small little town full of wind and grit, and her childhood friends, they were also devastated to learn of her murder. They said that she had always been shy, but she was very artistic. That is how she would express herself to people. She loved sketching people's faces, and she had this talent of capturing their expressions perfectly. One of her friends would even say that she could draw your expression before you even opened your mouth. You didn't have to tell her how you were feeling, she could draw it for you. She had married young, she had several children who then had their own children, and she was a grandmother to the best grandbabies. Her family said that she was patient, she was creative, and she was funny in that very understated way. She didn't have to be loud, but she had this sharp wit that was so captivating. Veronica, she had taught her kids and also her grandkids how to sew traditional garments, how to bead, how to reuse everything. I mean, this woman, she knew recycling better than anyone. She encouraged her family to keep old scraps, old bits of fabric. And they said that she actually saved every scrap of fabric like it was gold. Now, Veronica's last confirmed sighting, this had been in February of 2019, and by that April, her daughter had reported her missing. Now, Veronica's family, they had decided very early on that they wanted Veronica to be remembered as Veronica. They wanted her remembered by her full name, not just initials, not just by headlines, and they would participate in the MMIW vigils across Alaska. They held her photo right next to banners, and these banners, they read, "No more stolen sisters." Her daughter would tell the crowd who had gathered that Veronica was by no means perfect, but she was theirs, and they loved her in every shape and form. Now, advocacy groups, they would use both of these women's names to highlight exactly what they've been talking about for years, that Alaska has one of the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Do you know that between 2018 and 2023, state data had showed that Indigenous women, they accounted for nearly half of all homicides, and that is absolutely vile to think. The reasons for this, they are complicated, but they're also painfully predictable. Rural isolation, underfunded policing, and the tendency for people to ignore others who are living on Alaska's margins. And the thing is, Brian Smith, he didn't create that problem, but he absolutely exploited it. Because he meticulously chose women who he knew were deemed disposable by some. And that is what makes these crimes even more monstrous. But of course, I'm sure you've guessed that Brian Smith would definitely go to trial for this case. I mean, it was going to be a slam dunk. Now, the two families, the families of Kathleen and the family of Veronica, they came together and they sat front row with each other. Now, Eek and Nom, they might be hundreds of miles away, but they came in there together. They came in strong as a united front. They had red ribbons, red handprints, red shirts, and their message was very, very simple. Remember these women. And that is the purpose of telling this case. This is why these stories are so important. This is two women from different corners of Alaska who deserve to be more than just a footnote in a killer's timeline. They are the ones that matter. Brian Smith, trash, garbage. We don't even need to remember him. Even at this point, when we have two devastated families sitting in a courtroom, Brian Smith still shows no remorse. During his arraignment, he actually smiles. He's smiling at the judge. I don't know who the hell he thinks he is, but he smiled at that judge when the judge had read the charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 2 counts of evidence tampering. And this, to him, was an occasion to smile. Reporters who were in the courtroom at the time, they said it was a really weird experience to be in there and seeing this guy because he seemed to be very engaged in his trial. And people might say that's normal, but he was really engaged. He was like really curious. He even started like jotting down notes as if he was like auditing his own trial. Like, judge stuttered over words, not very professional. But the prosecution strategy, I mean, it was kind of a slam dunk. It was very easy. They were just going to show the jury how methodical this monster had been. And they didn't have to speculate about this weirdo's mindset. I mean, the footage spoke for itself. Now, the state's forensic analysis, they had determined that the timestamps on the SD card within the images, within the videos, these all perfectly aligned to when Kathleen was murdered. There was no question about it. Now, the defence, on the other hand, they have very, very little to work with. And so much so that they filed motions to suppress the video, arguing chain of custody issues. No, the only issue you've got is that you've got an absolute piece of shit sitting in front of you, and you know there is no way to defend him. He is a monstrosity to society, and quite frankly, should be taken off the face of the earth. Oh my god, I just caught myself in the viewfinder, and here I am slandering Brian Smith when I'm sitting here like Coco the frickin' clown. Let me blend. But yeah, so the court, they have basically ruled that the evidence they've received is airtight. They're not throwing anything out, so up you, basically. So the defence, they're thinking, God, I mean, we really only have one option here, and that's to try and persuade the jury that Brian Smith was a disturbed individual rather than a calculated predator. Bitch, where? All he was calculated his whole frickin' life. But thankfully, the jury did not buy it. Now, when the prosecution delivered their closing arguments, they had described Smith as a man who documented his evil because he thought that no one would ever find it. And the jurors, they would later state that this very sentiment stuck with them. It was the slam dunk for them because they just thought, yeah, can't argue it. No way. After less than 2 days of deliberation, the jury would return their verdict. And that verdict was guilty on all counts. Now, Brian Smith, he had stood whilst the judge had read the decision, and as the judge did, there was not really any kind of reaction from him. He didn't look angry, he didn't look sad, he didn't honestly seem that bothered. All he really did was give a small nod, which, as we know, is something he's done all his life. Now, as that gavel came down, Kathleen and Veronica's family, they were sitting in the front row. Some of them were crying, some of them were just completely rigid because finally they were able to breathe after all this time. But of course for them, just because this man's been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, that doesn't bring back their daughter. It doesn't bring back their sister, their loved one, their auntie, their grandparent. It doesn't bring them back. It doesn't fix it. Anchorage would go through a very strange phase after this trial because suddenly everyone was looking at everyone differently, side-eyeing them just a little bit. Guests in hotels were checking their rooms twice, looking under the bed, looking in the closets because they didn't trust that they were safe now. The people who worked alongside Brian Smith, they started to doubt their other co-workers. How can I trust my judgment of someone when I've worked alongside a murderer for years? And I actually cannot believe I'm saying this, but I need to give the press their props within this case because instead of sensationalising Brian Smith, instead of trying to, give him his nickname and this and that and get scoops, get interviews, they immediately shifted the focus to these women. and shifted the focus to Indigenous women, to the systemic failures that allowed this monster to move through the city unseen. The Alaska Native Women's Resource Centre, they did put out a statement, and they said that although this brings some form of justice, it doesn't bring safety. Our sisters are still disappearing. And it's like a punch to the gut because we all know it's true. Yeah, we've got justice of some sort for these two women, but there are so many more. So many more who haven't got justice, who won't get justice. So many more women who will continue to be targeted. Because, like I've said, this problem didn't begin or end with Brian Smith. He was simply a symptom of this complete chaos. MMIW activists, they would use these cases as their catalyst. They would hold marches throughout Anchorage. They had red handprints over their mouths to symbolise the forced silence of Indigenous women. Posters of Kathleen and Veronica, they were held up throughout these marches. There was signs saying, "No more stolen sisters, we are still here." And this wasn't a protest for the sake of noise. This was a demand of visibility. Now, local lawmakers, they did promise change. They said that they would get better resources for missing persons databases, better coordination with tribal authorities, a dedicated liaison office for rural cases. And some of these things actually happened, but others are still stuck in budget meetings because it all comes down to a price. But for once, people were finally paying attention. Even journalists, they were revisiting old cases of Indigenous women who have went missing. They asked the questions of whether any of these could be connected or whether these could be reopened and investigated further. And it wasn't because they were expecting to find more victims of Smith. I mean, listen, they might. But it was his exposure that had made people realise how easily vulnerable people within Alaska can disappear. Now, I do also want to mention that even though Brian Smith, he received his sentence, 226 years in prison, he will never ever be out. Great stuff. But when detectives continued going through his devices, they did find images that points to a third victim. Now, I do have to say that this victim still remains unconfirmed. We could say unidentified, but the family of Cassandra Boskovsky have come forward and they've suspected that she might have been his third victim. But again, this hasn't been confirmed. And it is worth noting that whilst Cassandra Boskovsky cannot be confirmed as the third victim in this case, in 2024 there was a presumptive hearing by which she had been declared legally dead. So I do hope that we get answers for Cassandra's family, whether she was a victim of Smith or not. They deserve to know what happened to their loved one. And one thing I really want you to remember, when it comes to Kathleen Joe Henry and when it comes to Veronica Abouchuk, what we need to remember here is these were two Indigenous women who were reported missing, and clearly not enough was being done to find them, because throughout the world, Indigenous women and men are disappearing. And the resources don't seem to stretch far enough to find them justice, and that needs to change. This whole case shows us how easy it is for people to disappear, and the world doesn't blink. People just scroll by, people walk by. No one knows because it's not being spoken about enough. So please remember the names of Kathleen, remember the names of Veronica, remember these Indigenous women who need help, who need change. I will ensure that I leave some links down below, some statistics so you can read into it for yourself. I'm going to do as much digging as I can, find websites and resources that I think could be beneficial for us all to look at and to help support Indigenous women and men all across the world. To Kathleen and Veronica, I just hope that wherever they are resting peacefully. I wish their family healing. I'm sending them all my love, all my prayers. And to Brian Smith, I hope you rot in hell. You are the scum of the earth. But my loves, that is it for another true crime and makeup episode. I really, really hope this one was interesting to you. Hopefully it was a new one to some of you, and hopefully we can bring awareness to Indigenous women and men who are going missing all across the world. That statistic will forever haunt me, that Indigenous women make up 18% of Alaska's population, and yet they make up nearly half of female homicides. Please let that sit with you and let it anger you. because sometimes we need to get angry to make change. Before you go, please don't forget to engage with this video in some way. You know it means the absolute freaking world to me. If you can like, comment, subscribe, share if you feel obliged. Most importantly though, if you can hype up this video, it would mean the world. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, social media handles, products used on my face today, they are all listed down below. You can also leave your case suggestions in the comments, or you can send me a DM on Instagram. If you do send it on Instagram, please be patient. I do work my way through my messages, but I do have quite a lot that have come in. And also I get creeps in my DMs, and sometimes it's a scary place to go. Like, no, I do not want to sell you feet pics. I did ballet for a number of years. Trust me, these feet, they ain't great. You don't want to see them. I wouldn't even be able to charge you in good faith money to see these feet. But anyway, that is it for today. If you watched this far, please leave a blue heart down below, or a blue emoji, like a dolphin, or I don't know, a car, whatever you can find that's blue, leave it down below. But that is it for today. So please, please, please remember, be a good person. Do not be a bad person. Stay safe. Look after each other. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.